On behalf of OIL, the Organization for Islamic Learning, it is an honor and a privilege to welcome Sheikh Arif, who has joined us all the way from the UK and has taken time out of his busy schedule to be with us.
I'll give you a little background on Sheikh Arif because I see a lot of new faces here, and I think it'll be good to just give that. Originally, Sheikh Arif is from Uganda. He moved to England, like many of us, we had to move across for further study, so he went to England for further education and graduated from Madrasa Al-Khoi. He's also been to Iran for Arabic and Islamic studies. In England, he established the Al-Mahdi Institute in the UK, which is one that I have had the privilege of visiting as well. And currently he's the director and senior lecturer at Al-Mahdi, where he teaches Usul al-Fiqh and Islamic philosophy. And I'm going to introduce our speaker, Sheikh Arif, please, with a loud salawat.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Alhamdulillah, Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalam ala ashrafil anbiya'i wal mursaleen, wa alihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. Amma ba'd, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm indeed honored and privileged to be given this opportunity to discuss such a central theme that affects every thinking, conscious human individual at some point in his or her life. And to a great extent, the response to this question shapes their outlook and the way in which they lead real human life. Basically, the existence of suffering and its reconciliation with the existence of God. This question, inasmuch as it poses a problem in the minds of the antagonists and brings about an argument that defeats the existence of God, it also assures the theist and the believer of the existence of God and allows them to endure during trials, sufferings, misfortunes, calamities. What makes this debate a very real debate is that, as opposed to a philosopher who thinks in an abstract sense through a process of rational propositions and comes to conclusion, is that real life and real people live through this problem in a very different way. It is here that we see that no form of philosophical response or deliberation upon such a fundamental issue is going to be satisfactory. There has to be the input of real human experience and real human beings, and then it can be made sense of. It is here that's why we thought that prior to advancing the logical and the philosophical, the mystical, the spiritual arguments and discussions for or against the existence of God or reconciliation of suffering and the existence of a benevolent, omnipotent, omniscient God, that we should, as a starting point, share our real human experiences concerned with this very issue, which then sets the scene for our discussions. On the one hand, and hopefully after at the end of our interactive session, we will introduce the subject and how we propose to take it forward in the next 2 days. On the one hand, we find a world. When we say a world, we do not necessarily mean Mother Earth. We are talking about existence at large, whatever is conceivable, observable, and whatever can be imagined beyond that. We see a wonderful world that operates meticulously with utmost precision. When we look at human history, we see gray areas, bleak areas. We see instances of great suffering. We see instances of discord. But when we look at the past in the context of the present, we always come out with an understanding that that was necessary for this stage to be achieved. We always state to ourselves that that was something which was considered evil at that point, but it has contributed to an overall good at this point. When we look at the life of this earth and the way the earth is arranged, we find that nothing is out of place. Now, in the face of all this beauty, design, arrangement, purposeful world, at present, when we look into ourselves as individuals, and when we look at the human community, we find that it sticks out like a sore thumb at times. We find that we cannot reconcile between the notion of beauty that prevails everywhere, purposeful existence, and my suffering at present. Whether that suffering be experienced by me psychologically in my own context, or be suffered by me through observing the sufferings of others. It is here then that we ask the question that if everything is so well designed, so purposeful, and if the world that we subscribe to is truly the all-perfect, knowing, omnipotent God who has no limitations, then why does He allow this state to prevail? Now, pay special attention to what we are saying. When we look in hindsight, everything seems to fall in place. I'm talking about the absolute present, but at present, I am suffering. At present, this is the plight of the human community. Yes, Hussein Salamullah alayhi was killed brutally. People allowed it to happen. If Imam Hussein was on his journey to his Allah Jalla Jalaluhu, then he maybe have accepted whatever was coming his way gracefully. But what of those people from his family who were affected adversely through his brutal killing? They felt horrendous pain, unbearable pain, and it was a horrendous crime that was committed. Children were kept thirsty, and a child's throat was slit. But what about the mother of that child? Now, today when we look at that scene, we will say it was a necessary condition for humanity to have progressed to the level to which it has progressed now. Today, we will not allow a tyrant to chip away at our autonomy, free will, liberty, because Hussein has set an example of defiance for us. This is not what we're talking about. We are talking about the present time in which Imam Hussein was killed and the sufferings that ensued at that point, and the mother who must have prayed for the life of her 6-month-old child and was denied. Today we know that the fact that I'm using Imam Hussein as an example because we relate to him in a very caring, loving, gentle, affectionate way. And it moves us all. Today we know that maybe it was good that Abbas ibn Ali did not fetch the water from the Alqama. We know it was good. Today we know. For what Abbas stands for. But at the time when Abbas looked towards the heavens, and this is a description, and his eyes filled with tears, and he said, "O Lord, do not disappoint me. Allow me to take water, bring water back to these thirsty children." He made that prayer. He was in that position where he required assistance and maybe intervention, but was denied. At that moment of denial, is there a question Well, what is happening? You can't find somebody better than Abbas to make a supplication. On the other hand, God responds and says, ask me and I shall grant. We will not expect God to deny. Now, although today we are making sense of that incident in the positive way, I'm talking about it at the time when it was happening. Similarly, at present in our lives, we find a lot of suffering. This suffering apparently becomes a point of conflict. On the one hand, we believe in a God that has no restriction and is perfectly good. On the other hand, we are seeing a perfectly good world. But for one facet of the world, which is human existence, animal existence, our interaction with our situations, and the suffering that comes through it. That is one point at present that is confusing us. Now, we have seen the human community either grow through this towards God at present, or flatly deny the existence of God. Now, before we get into our discussions, we will obviously be explaining every term that we will be using so that there is not much ambiguity. By and large, we find that the thinking becomes blurred due to presumptions in our language, so we will clarify the terms. But before we go into our discussions, we need to set the scene. As we said, in truth, it is a human discussion, not human as philosopher, nor human as a logician, nor human as a Sufi. It is a human discussion per se, human as human. I experience this in my life. What does it mean to me, and how do I make sense of it? Now I see that some of the tables are fairly full and the others are empty, so I don't know how we will conduct this particular session, unless, of course, maybe if we can merge the people on the table so that all of them are full, and it's a very directed and a concise discussion. We need to respond to the next 4 questions sequentially. These series of questions will set the tone for the rest of our discussion, so if we can just write them down. And this is all based on our experiences and the way we have led our lives and the way we are at present. What role does God play, or what function does God have in our lives during moments of suffering? Whether the suffering affects us directly or indirectly. That's the first question. 2, at points, why doesn't God relieve our suffering? 3, why has God created a world, and I'm going to use a term here, but I said I'll clarify it afterwards, that has evil and that leads to suffering? And the final question, on the basis that there really is evil in the world that leads to suffering, and God does not remove it, then does that pose a problem for the existence and the nature of God? Now, I've used the term suffering and left it ambiguous, not explaining. And there is a reason for doing so, because we all understand suffering and what it means without definition. Yes? So a wall may break in this banquet hall. For example, nobody will get hurt. It won't mean anything to me. But the owner who has spent a lot of money will be suffering. It is his psychological interaction with that event, whether that event is deemed as evil or otherwise. And that's why we've used the word suffering. Now, if we can just maybe group ourselves more fully, and within 20 minutes, each table can give their thoughts, and that will set the scene for our discussions. Okay, the God that we will be discussing will have several definitions, but we will go by the theistic definition of God. The theistic definition, I'll just say it for now, and afterwards we'll discuss properly, is an omnipotent God, all-powerful, omniscient, all-aware, omnipresent, who is everywhere, perfectly good and does not want anything but good. That's the notion of God.
حبيب الله رسول الله إمام المرسلين حبيب الله رسول الله إمام المرسلين سريت من حرم ليلا إلى حرم كما سرى البدر في تاج من الظلم سريت من حرم ليلا إلى حرم كما سرى البدر في تاج من الظلم.
Can we have a spokesman from each table to maybe for a couple of minutes? I know a couple of minutes are not enough, but the thinking that's been done already should allow us to meaningfully conduct the discussions that are to follow. So if we can have a person from each table giving their thoughts very quickly and in a very precise manner.
On the first question, God's role, we're saying that this depends upon your view of God, whether you consider him as a micromanager or a macro manager. Why was there even a need to create the world was one of the questions that was asked at the table. As far as the suffering, or God's role in suffering is concerned, the opinion expressed is that it is not really about the individual's suffering, it is about God's design in terms of perpetrating, if that's the case, that suffering on that particular individual. Suffering, in our view, provides growth of an individual. If there is not a test of an individual, how will he, on the day of judgment, have an opportunity to say one way or another about the individual? It is through suffering that you test your mettle. Your faith and belief in God helps you through your suffering. Question 2? Question 2, why doesn't God relieve suffering? If there is no suffering, there is no appreciation of good. Growth as an individual, suffering provides growth for an individual. Suffering gives you an understanding of good and bad, health, hell and heaven. God does not relieve suffering because of the greater good eventually, of which we have no understanding or perspective. Even scientific discoveries, an increase in our knowledge, has a basis on human suffering. If God had intervened, these likely would not have occurred. Question 3, why has God created evil? I think a lot of that has already been answered in response to question 2. Question 4, evil does not pose a problem. Evil, does it pose a problem for the existence or nature of God? Yes, it does, but then individual faith comes into play. And I guess that's why we are here on a Saturday morning.
That God, if he were to relieve evil, there would be no growth. However, is their need for excessive evil. Could God not have reduced a little bit of it, namely horrendous, gratuitous, pointless, needless evil? So think on that for now, but obviously the responses are there.
My name is Nusrat Rahimtullah, and I'm talking on behalf of Table 8. And please, if you feel that I've not correctly represented you, you can jump in at any time. So we felt that the role that God plays in our lives during moments of suffering is that He gives us security and comfort, and we begin to think of ourselves as low and as Him as high. So we are always looking up to Him at times of suffering, and when it is indirect as well. On the flip side of it, we tend to sometimes blame Him for what could have been a decision on our part that resulted in some evil or some suffering. At points, why doesn't God relieve us of our suffering? That's a question that has always crossed my mind, especially when we have elderly people who are bedridden for a long time, and we know that they're not going to get better, and we feel, well, what's the point in them suffering so much? But however, such suffering, we feel, or we have been told, that it relieves them of the sins that they may have committed, and she pointed out that when some studies were done on people who had short-term suffering, the person who was happy before the suffering, and if they went through a period of suffering, at the end when their status of happiness was looked at, it was about the same. So we feel that it comes and goes in cycles, and eventually you don't remember the intensity of what it was at the time when you experienced it. And suffering does help us grow, like the other table said, and also we feel that it shows us our true selves. And sometimes that is something that we can reflect on, and it makes us accept that, oh, this is what my true self is if I think about it. Then why has God created a world that has evil and that leads to suffering? Sometimes when I think about this, I think that He allows this to happen perhaps in the grand scheme of things, where He says that yes, there is opportunity for you to do good. So if there is someone suffering, it provides a whole bunch of other people opportunities to do good, to give karze hasanat and other things that He has outlined for us, and to relieve other people's suffering, and in that way increase our own happiness. So that's one point. Yes, we do feel that as human beings, we do question the existence of God at times in the deepest of our hearts. Though we know that God exists, we say, okay, especially when it comes to little children and they're suffering, and He says, what has this little child done to deserve this? And I think part of that is because we define suffering differently from what it is meant to be. Maybe it was never meant to be called suffering, and we associate the word suffering in a different form.
What role does God play, or what in function have in our lives during suffering? And we said that we suffer because God is testing us. That's the common explanation that we have been hearing. It gives us hope when we are suffering. It gives us hope and comfort that there is somebody else, another entity that's coming to our rescue. It awakens us. It awakens ourselves. And by suffering, we can then come and enjoy the counter-suffering. In other words, the opposite of suffering. After the suffering has gone away, we can appreciate the goodness that comes. If there was no suffering and there was all goodness, we may not be appreciating it at all. And then there is a purpose. Knowing that there is a purpose in our suffering. We didn't go into discussing what could be the purpose, but there might be a purpose that we may not be aware of. And lastly, we suffer so that we can at least say that we are grateful we are suffering only this much and not more like other people are suffering. So that gives us some kind of a balance or perspective of our suffering. The second question, again, we said that God is testing us. Why doesn't God intervene? Because maybe it is for good, our own good, and it's sometimes suffering, like you said in the case of Hazrat Abbas, it was good for humanity in general. So we suffer so that in hindsight we look back and we can find that, well, there was some goodness that was learned or achieved for humanity, for the general good, by some people suffering. The question then arises is, who should be chosen to suffer so for the good of others, you know? And number 3, I don't remember, question number 3 was, why has God created a world that has evil and suffering? And we said that, again, it was for testing us and for growth. Evil, they said, makes you strive for betterment. If there was no evil, we'll be just laissez-faire and just sit and do nothing. But if there is suffering and evil, we would try to improve ourselves to get out of that suffering. Otherwise, we'll just decay and atrophy into that one situation only. And the last one was, we didn't get much time to discuss that, but the question is, God doesn't do anything. Why doesn't God do anything about our suffering? Well, that again assumes that we are going with the theistic definition of God and that there is a God, and he doesn't intervene because he wants us to test us and to strive to get out of whatever situation we are in and improve our maybe problem-solving abilities or our thinking, or just to get out of a situation.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Shiraz Rahmani, and I'm representing table number 2. And it was a short time to come to some real conclusions, but some of the points that were discussed, I'll mention them. Firstly, this table had a contention with your opening arguments that suffering and pain and evil in the historical perspective, you can understand it because it resulted in some good. And you gave a very specific and unusual example of Imam Hussain al-Islam. So we feel that lots of, if you look through history, that lots of events have occurred where senseless wars have exterminated whole populace, the World War, the Holocaust, things that happened in Rwanda in recent history. What good came out of them? And, this is, so in order to convince us about your argument, you have to give us more specific examples and not unusual examples of highly spiritual persons involved in suffering. Regarding the question of what function does God have in our lives while we are suffering? So it depends, this group felt, on what you believe God is. If you believe that there is an all-powerful, almighty God, merciful God, all-knowing God, you have hope from Him. So even though not all your prayers may be answered, you still have the emotional support, because suffering, as far as we are concerned, is more a response, a psychological response, rather than the actual pain, or because that's very subjective and depends on the emotional development of the person going through that. And we felt that if you go with the flow, if you do not resist, if you accept it as the will of God, then your suffering, although the pain will be there, but your suffering will be reduced. And you can come out as a stronger, more, a better person if you do surrender. And of course, that depends on your religious belief. Regarding question number 2, we felt that suffering is an integral part of our humanity, just like we have been given emotions. And emotions actually is what results in suffering, because the emotions kick in when we respond to a system, to an event. So humanity is as part of humanity as love or joy is. So that's what we felt. Suffering helps us in becoming more aware of our own limited humanness and of the existence of a higher being, you know. So if there is no suffering, you can go around your merry ways and not even really be aware or even think very much about your Creator. So suffering helps us in arriving at a higher state. Question number 2: why doesn't God relieve our suffering? Since God has created a world where suffering exists, it is from His knowledge, the all-knowing God has created it for our betterment. But once again, it is difficult to reconcile it with our emotional being emotional beings. We respond to these and at times contend with it that why has God given us this suffering? Question number 3: why has God created a world that has evil and that leads? I think it is very much a part of question number 2. If you answer 2, then you have already answered 3. And based on the basis of question 4, actually we did not get too much time to address it.
And I think we had 2 different viewpoints going through these questions. And one where the belief was that God doesn't have a role in suffering, and specifically to answer question number 1, that God doesn't have a role in moments of suffering. Like other people have said, when there is a belief in God and He has a role, it's a role that God plays as one of hope, to give man an outlet to vent their frustrations, to act as a listener of prayer, both the formalized prayer of 100 rakats of this or 1,000 recitations of that, and the internal or whispered prayer for the relief of the person who's suffering. And God also gives mankind the opportunity to be His representative to ease others' suffering. So as a witness of someone who is going through some sense of suffering, we're given the opportunity to assist, to help, to try and ease another's suffering.
So for question number 2, we had 2 different viewpoints. So one viewpoint was that He does not intervene in daily life. And then the other viewpoint was that we go through suffering because we have not understood the long-term vision of God. So our vision is very limited. His vision is the more bigger picture. And also that suffering challenges your belief system and kind of tells you where you're at.
For point number 3, why has God created a world that has evil and leads to suffering? Again, 2 viewpoints. So the first one is that God didn't create evil, that evil came from within man. And similar with sickness and disease, we believe that man's actions throughout time has created sickness and disease.
Okay, so we didn't quite get to number 4, but just to add to number 3, there was another point about why has God created a world? So it's to kind of manifest Himself in the creation. And so everyone has the potential of that in themselves, but then there's also the potential for evil that leads to suffering. So it's just kind of going back to the point of there's kind of that duality, I guess, both would exist, and that in itself can lead to the evil. So if you have that duality, that could lead to evil. And just one more thing too is suffering itself is kind of a perception. So it's kind of internal where we feel suffering. So that was it. So that's all we have for our table.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Jawed. I missed the beginning of the talk, so if I go off key, please stop me. The first question had to do with the role of God during our suffering. One of the key points we came up with at our table, which other people have referenced earlier today, is that is suffering the actual stimulus, the bad things that happen to us in our lives, or is it our reaction to it? Meaning, is it our resistance to it? I know in counseling for patients, we often discuss this fact now, that suffering is the equation of being equal to the stimulus times your resistance to it. when you give up the resistance to it, when you align your acceptance of reality with what God has given you, then perhaps the suffering goes away. And that goes along with the studies reference about people who've lost limbs in war, for example, and the average level of happiness returning to what it was before losing the limb within about 6 months on average. Some people, of course, can go years, and some people can be over it much quicker. And the same goes for grief. The assumption that everybody goes through stages of suffering for grief is in fact not true when you look at it. Some people are able to accept it and transition much faster. So perhaps suffering is the inability to adapt or accept a different viewpoint than what your ego told you beforehand. So why doesn't God relieve our suffering? And our table pretty much unanimously agreed that he actually does. He gives you the opportunity and the ability to overcome that resistance through the offering of that incident of suffering, which is an opportunity for you to give up your expectation or desire and align it with what he wants for you, and which is the end of your suffering. And the last question number 3 was about why does God...
Why does God create a world that has evil that leads to suffering?
Okay, so why does God create a world that has evil that can lead to suffering? And one of the viewpoints that we had at our table was perhaps he doesn't create a world that has evil, because I would assume that evil is a separate, true, existent thing, as opposed to simply the absence of good, which is God. That perhaps our rejection of good is what allows us to act in our own selfish ways. That it is simply a denial of light, as opposed to darkness being a thing in and of itself. And that goes along with what we see in Surah Al-Nur, where the Prophet is described as that lens, the light in the lantern, not the light in the lantern, but the glass in the lantern that allows the light of God to shine on the world. And perhaps if we have an ego, then that smudges the glass, that stops the light from shining through that we all have within ourselves, the breath of Allah in each of us. And the fourth question was on the basis of if we believe that there actually really is evil in the world that leads to suffering and God doesn't stop it, does that cause a problem with our existence and understanding of the nature of God? And I believe it would if we actually believe those things were real and not simply a denial of the light.
We have very brief answers. We didn't realize we were supposed to do essays on each one. So, question 1, God strengthens us from within to deal with the suffering ourselves based on our capacities. The answer to question 2, God wants to be recognized through suffering and to understand his mystery through his teachings. Question 3, evil is relative to see good, and man created evil, challenged to man to transcend its own being. And for question 4, we actually didn't get to it. We just put, yes, it does pose a problem.
For the first one, the role of God, I think, we, along with being a source of peace and solace, and having opportunity to communicate with God, we also thought that it was a reminder to us, and this is similar to what others have said, that at that time you feel a lot, maybe you don't have control over things, and so you hand the burden over, and understand. It reminds you that there's a plan that's bigger than what you may have thought, and you sort of give the burden over to that, and so that can, so God can be a source of solace in that way as well, and serve as a reminder. The second question about, what was the second question? Yes, why doesn't God relieve us of our suffering? We said that suffering has a function similar to what others have said towards our growth and evolution, not just as individuals, but as humanity at large. Question number 3, why has God created a world that has evil in it that leads to suffering? And we said, it can, again, back to the, there is a function. It's not a design flaw. It is, it serves a function that leads to our growth. And I think that's about it. And then number 4, we didn't actually come up with a clear answer to that one, so I'm going to leave it.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Sarfaraz. First of all, we have general points that apply to each question, and the first point is that what separates human beings from the rest of the creation is the freedom of choice and the desire and ability to grow. Number two, man is very hasty. They want immediate action, whereas God is slow and he wants you to grow. Definition of suffering varies from person to person, and therefore it applies to all these questions. Only by seeing what doesn't exist can you appreciate what exists. So if you don't see evil, you don't appreciate the good. Okay, so the question number one, the situation is like mother and child. When the mother punishes a child, what is she suffering, or is he suffering, the child suffering? And the same way with God. Why doesn't God release our suffering? Because he wants us to grow and progress, and he's just acting as a facilitator, and he intervenes when it's necessary. Why has God created a world which has evil? Again, you will not appreciate good unless you see evil. And like I said, God has time, and he works slowly, whereas we are in haste. On the basis that there is evil, does God exist? Yes, God exists, but again, like I said, he has time. He is not in a haste, and therefore he acts slowly and allows you to grow.
The answers that you have provided sum up the answers that have been provided by theologians, theists, and philosophers that have supported the case for the existence of a theistic God. Now, I'm just going to summarize them and try and point out certain other things. Amongst the responses that you have given, one has been growth and promotion of good through a process of life that entails suffering as a response to what we consider as incompatible situations or evil. Two, this world, the way it is, was necessary for allowing freedom of will and choice. We will come to the definition of evil as either moral or natural evil. Moral evil cannot be possible without allowing freedom of choice. Three, God's ways are mysterious. We don't understand what he is doing, how he is doing, and as a result, it results in evil and suffering, but there has to be some reason for it that is above us. Another response was that evil is relative. What can really constitute suffering in the rightest sense? It's called a case of definition. Four, well, keeping with the mysterious nature of God, we talked of a greater purpose that we are achieving. So at present, whatever the situation is leading to a greater good, whether that be in the individual's own capacity or humanity and existence at large. Another response was that good and evil are complementary. They derive definitions of each other through each other. If there was no evil, there would be no such thing as good. We were talking about suffering particularly, but obviously it has progressed into a much deeper discussion. Another response was a very curious response, which has already been given by the philosophers, that evil is illusionary. There is no evil, and therefore the question, God and evil, is a non-starter, because there is no such thing as evil. Another response was a very mystical one, that we are becoming God-like and we are becoming godly through the process of our interaction with what we deem as evil and suffering. Another response is a phenomenal response, that God does relieve suffering, but we do not perceive it. Although to make sense of it would be difficult. I am suffering, and I am told that he has relieved your suffering, but I'm saying I'm still suffering. And I'm told you don't perceive it, but I'm perceiving suffering. I don't know how we can frame that in a philosophical way, but it's a phenomenal response. Another response is the one known as the original sin, that there is no evil. Evil is a product of human action. Philosophically is termed as the fall of man, or the fall of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, which results in all forms of evils. Evil is non-existence, is the contrary of good, and therefore God can never be the author of evil, for God only authors existence. Bear in mind, this is plausible, but our question was, our interaction with evil results in suffering. Explanation was given about suffering being a stimulus response. The fact is, the response is there, and at present, I am feeling it. One of the response was me and the general good, that I am suffering, I'm experiencing evil for the general good. I ask a question, why me? Why not anybody else? What connection do I have with the rest of humanity? A fundamental question is, whose choice was it anyway? We asked a question, and two, why did God create this world? He could have chosen not to create. Whose choice was it anyway? One of the questions that is there, which was a fundamental question that nobody responded to, was, I mean, of course, people did respond, the assertion that I made, that in hindsight, we see that they contributed to the overall good. Here then we question that is there an overall good in the first place, or is this a presumption within itself? Two, those horrendous instances of evil that have gone in the history of human beings, did they contribute to the good at all? Or is it that the good would have been attained, if there is any good and growth, without that incident? And that is what makes the whole of this inquiry a pressing inquiry, because that is where we want to narrow it down to. All of us here are not in Rwanda. We are not in a land that is drought-stricken. We are not seeing our children die. We are talking about the building of a moral human individual, but poverty rids a human being of any sense of morality. A person who is starving to death will not care for the morality of speaking the truth. And I have experienced this firsthand when I've visited places on the face of this earth. Of course, there might be diminished responsibility, but the fact is that it does not set the ground for the creation of a moral person, and this is what we have witnessed. Hunger and starvation leads to stealing, theft, and justification of it. This is what we see in our lives. So here, when we have responded to this, bear in mind that there is a limitation, and that is our own context. It is not difficult to look at other people's contexts and at least to imagine their situation and to say that my responses are wishful responses. There may be other responses which are not as encouraging. But if it suits us to lead our lives like this, and if it enables growth, then that is fine. I just want to make the problem acute so that I have a worth for the next 2 days. Otherwise, if these responses are to be accepted at face value, then the responses have been gotten and I have no more function to play. So in order to increase your suffering, and in order to increase my hedonistic pleasures, we are going to put further twists to it, introduce the subject now, and leave us for a 15-20 minute break. When a person prays to God, They are praying for relief. The immediate relief often is not provided. Subsequent to that, we offer justification. I was in a situation where there was an 18-year-old child on full life support machines. I made this qualification that at present, not in hindsight, at present, the doctors were saying to the parents that we need to withdraw the extraordinary life support system. I'm not talking here about the theological problem that it created. I'm talking about the human problem and the human dilemma. Now here, the doctor is there saying that, look, we need to let her go with dignity. Because she is suffering, let her go. The mother is beside herself, and this is a real situation. The mother is saying, but it's my child. We can do something for her. If we were to keep the life support systems, God can intervene and can do anything He wants. This is the God we believe in. He can do anything He wants. Yes? And that belief is reaffirmed by religious literature. Inna Allah ala kulli shay'in qadir. Allah is capable or able to do anything He wants. And here, Allah meant the ordinary mind to understand it in a very ordinary way. Not a philosophical mind to come and interpret it away. To say the meaning of all powerful is not what you understand. I say, no, Lord, you said that. If my father were to have said, Arif, if your business is failing, I will intervene. I'll inject more money into it. I understand it at face value. This is how I understand my God's words. And furthermore, He stated that Abraham cut all the birds and He resurrected them again. He stated that He gave child to Sarah and Ibrahim when they had become totally unproductive. He intervened. That is the belief of God that sustains me, yes, as a theist. Now at that point the mother is begging and saying, God, give her life. On the other hand, the doctors are saying, let her go with dignity. Now this is an acute problem of suffering. And it's a dilemma. Of course, in hindsight, when we look at the mother and we talk with her, she said, yes, it was the best thing that happened for her. Her time had come, she had to go, and if she had lived, her life might have been impaired. I'm asking a question here, that this is a response given at a later date. I am talking about a response that is to be given at present. And that is what makes the problem acute. Because in hindsight, as our human conditions dictate, we have to adapt. So here is a problem. Does God intervene? If so, why doesn't He? Does He intervene at instances? If so, why does He prefer one over the other? Is God acting in a uniform way that He chooses not to intervene at all? Then why does He call for prayers? Why is there this deep sense of need within us to pray? Why is there this belief, this condition that we have to pray and expect a response from Him? Or is it the case that God cannot do much about it? He just can't do much about it. In which case, is that God worthy of being God, called God in the first instance? Yes? Now I want to just introduce the discussions that are to follow by giving a bit of a prelude from a theistic perspective. A person who believes in a perfect God, We want to define a theistic God in the next session. We want to define certain terms like evil, good, and what type of evil is causing the problem for the existence or the nature of God. William Paley is attributed with bringing about one of the best design arguments for the existence of God. It might be a little lengthy, my presentation, but bear with me. He states that if I were to be walking upon a beach and stumble upon a rock, I will not look again at it. I would not think about it. But if I were to kick an object and then examine it and find that, oh, it's a timepiece, a watch, and looked at it and saw it is meticulously designed. Every piece of it is functioning properly. There is not a single flaw in there. Then this would prompt me to think that this did not arrive here by itself. Not only that it did not arrive here by itself, it will also make me think that the person who is the author of this timepiece is a very intelligent entity. So from this I deduce two things. That there is a maker of this timepiece, and by seeing it function so well, it forces me to believe that the maker is an intelligent maker. When me and you view the world, this is what we arrive at anyway. When we see the plant kingdom, the vegetable kingdom, the animal kingdom, the stars, the celestial bodies, the position of the sun, the earth, the satellite of the earth rotating around the earth, the tilt of the earth, the axis of the earth, every single thing operates with utmost precision. The ratio of air, the plants giving out oxygen, we carbon dioxide, sustaining each other, feeding off each other, everything is brilliantly, meticulously placed in place. Two, we are looking at the promotion of life and growth upon the face of this earth, and we are seeing that that function is being achieved. The human community has reached a staggering number of 7 billion. Now, whether wars have killed us in the past, famines and plagues have reduced the numbers of human beings, the success story is in the increase of the world population. Our ability to exploit nature and make it work for us and promote greater life. So when we look in hindsight, we find that no matter what happened, human beings are still growing and life is still evolving. There is a question, although, that without that incident, could it not still have grown? That is creating the problem. As a human condition in this life, we find hope sustains us. Hope for a better tomorrow. It has always sustained the growth of humanity. I want us to check our innermost sentiments on this. Do we always believe that tomorrow will be better than today? And does that really sustain the growth of the world? Amidst calamity, there is always a hope of relief. Hence we struggle. If we lost hope, there would be no struggle, whether we are theistic or atheist. Now here we know that we are not the author of this being, nor are we the organizers. So we say God is both the author and the organizer of existence. In this, we find that we need to relate to God in a very personal and an intimate way. For majority of us, the problem is created not because we don't believe in the existence of God or we believe in the existence of God. The problem is created only because we believe in a God who is personally involved and who is very caring. If we were to believe in a God who was not personally involved, then that would not pose a problem. But I have yet to find a human person who, before the stage of rationalizing, would believe in an impersonal God. I have yet to find a human person who in the early part of their life did not believe in a very personal God or in something that could relieve their distress. It feels as if it's a human condition to believe in something or what we call a God who is both personal and caring. It is only later on when we can't find or justify God that we make him impersonal and say, well, he's removed. But initially, we always believe in a very personal and a caring God. And we expect this God to respond to us. However, on instances when he does not respond, turns a deaf ear or a blind eye, then in that case, we then encounter a problem if we begin to think about it. Sometimes we don't encounter a problem because we don't think about this issue at all. But if we were to think about this issue, we can possibly find a problem. Now, going into this problem in discussion, we are going to give certain responses that will, or certain outlines that will provide the responses that we are after. Let us say that a person was involved in a car accident and they lost their consciousness. They wake up in a hospital. They will say, where am I? Where am I? Why am I here? And what are all these wires attached to me? But in this question, where am I? There is a presumption that I am and I know I am. Can you see that? The question is not asked, who am I? Why am I at all? What is this? That is not a question. The question is, where am I? And why am I, thank you, in this place as opposed to being in my car? These are the questions. Maybe there are more pressing questions that can provide a better response and more truer question. And that is, who am I and why am I? If we can ask these sort of questions, then maybe we will get a better response. Now, I've cut a lot of this discussion out. Here, what we have is the problem of evil and the existence of God. Historically, it has been phrased in two ways. Epicurus was the first one to raise this. We will talk about it in the second session. Hume, the skeptic philosopher, again enhanced the problem. Leibniz provided a response. John Hick provided a response. The Muslim philosophers have provided a response. The problem stands at two different levels. At the level of logic and at the level of experience. It's a logical problem in the sense that reason cannot bring about reconciliation between the notion of a theistic God and existence of evil. That's a logical problem. It is an experiential problem inasmuch as it does not seek to deny the existence of God through what we experience of evil. It seeks to undermine the possibility of the existence of God or the nature of the theistic God. So the way in which we will conduct our discussion will be, first and foremost, we will be looking at two different things which are interrelated. First is justifying or seeing if there is a justification for the existence of God despite the existence of evil and suffering, to see if they are consistent or not. In that, there will be two levels of discussion: logical discussion and what we call inductive discussion. In the logical discussion, the response is known as a defense. In the inductive discussion, the response is known as theodicy. And we will explain the meaning of theodicy. But in theodicy, as with the logical problem, there will be syllogisms constructed. If this is this, and this is this, and this is this, then the conclusion follows this way. But the conclusion doesn't follow this way, so there is a flaw in the whole thinking, unless we undermine one of the premise. That will be the logical and the inductive discussion. In the inductive discussion, we will be looking at two types of premise, the theological one and the inductive one, and trying to respond. And those responses will be known as theodicy. The second level of question, the second discussion will be the involvement and intervention of God in our lives, because that is a pressing issue at the level of our humanity and human discussion. This discussion will be conducted on the greater questions. Well, I am. Who am I? What is my relation to the world at large? So on and so forth. We will break now. Inshallah, resume in a little while and continue with the second session.